You people look so warm. I want to give them away, but Mrs. Muntz won't let me. She's crazy. Good afternoon, my friends, and welcome to beautiful Bluff City Cemetery. My name is Earl Muntz from Elgin, Illinois. I trust you are all well and healthy today. So few around here seem to be. And I hope you brought money. Lots and lots of money. For you see, in my lifetime, I made and sold many things. From used cars to new cars, car radios, stereos, hi-fis, 4-track tape players, television receivers, air conditioning. I even had my hand in mobile homes, aluminum houses, and cellular phones. I did it all. And I lost it all. 3 times. How did I do that? Well, I was America's #1 huckster, and I practiced the fine art of muntzing. But more about those things in a few minutes. First, let's review my 27-year connection with Elgin, Illinois. I was born here. I was raised here. I went to school here. However, I dropped out of high school after my first full year and subsequent full semester thereafter. In August of 1928, at the ripe age of 14, I was arrested by Elgin's finest for driving 58 miles an hour through heavy traffic. I was fined $8.90, and for the record, I was not wearing this outfit at that time. At the age of 20, I began selling used cars here in town and did so for 7 years until I moved to California, where one could make a bloody fortune selling cars, and I did. It was there in California that I became popular. So popular, in fact, that a survey conducted by Panner Motor Tours in 1946 listed me, Madman Muntz, as Southern California's 7th most popular tourist attraction. You should have seen the tour buses lined outside our car lots, crammed filled full of people, all hoping to catch a glimpse of me, Madman Muntz. It was hysterical. But what was it that I did that made me so popular? Well, let's just say it pays to advertise, and advertise I did. I started using radio, a lot of radio, and then I incorporated billboards. In a few minutes, I'd like to tell you of my favorite story about my favorite billboard. And then there were the skywriters, the people in the airplanes that would fly over large populated cities and spell Muntz TV. Remember that? A lot of people do. And then they even spelled my name out at halftime at the Rose Bowl, excuse me, in 1943. Now, for those of you that might remember, I was known to use some scantily clothed women, very beautiful women, to help sell products. Go ahead, ladies, let me hear it. And in the 1940s, during the heyday of communism, you know, here in the United States, McCarthy would go around shaking all the bushes and the trees, hoping the communists would fall out. I said to myself, this guy's getting a lot of press. So I contemplated joining the Communist Party. I didn't, however. The most effective way that I found to advertise was television. And that's where you could see me dressed exactly like this, saying things to you such as, I buy 'em retail and sell 'em wholesale. It's more fun that way. So outrageous, so outlandish were my highly successful ad campaigns that notorieties of our day, such as Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Steve Allen, would all use my name in their punchlines. Everyone knew me. I mean, everyone knew me. Even the troops marching to chow at the Santa Ana camp would sing the jingle that I made famous. M-U-N-T-Z. That's Muntz. M-U-N-T-Z. That's Muntz. Your turn. M-U-N-T-Z. That's Muntz. M-U-N-T-Z. That's Muntz. Ah, what a great marketing team I have here. Thank you. That last group, I told them don't give up the day job. But what was that other thing I told you about that I became famous for, that fine art of muncing? What was that all about? Well, during the heyday of my television manufacturing, I, Earl Muntz, a self-proclaimed engineer, and a damn good one I might add, was known for carrying around in my shirt pocket a pair of insulated nippers. I would go out into the shop where my engineers were and I'd visit them. And after a little bit of conversation, I'd take out my insulated nippers and I would reach over to the television sets that they were developing and I'd start clipping wires and then capacitors and then resistors. And if the television continued to work, we obviously didn't need those parts. So it reduced our costs and made us highly competitive in the marketplace. We even figured out a way to get around that automatic fine-tuning thing. Hey, you didn't need it if you lived in a metropolitan large area. You look out your window, you see the TV antenna, you didn't need it. So we didn't install the automatic fine-tuning knob. Now our competition really tried to take us to task for that. They called our television cheap bull. They weren't cheap. They were easy to use. They cost a lot less, and they were no better or no worse than our competition. I really enjoyed making televisions. I really did. The entire process fascinated me. So much so that when my first and only daughter was born, I named her TV. Spelled T-E-E-V-E-E. And then we had our only son. Guess what we named him? Jim. We named him Jim. I was married 7 times to 7 beautiful women. But I don't mind to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I had a hell of a time keeping their first names straight. I lived in an all-white house with all-white ceilings and all-white flooring and all-white furniture and all-white countertops and all-white appliances and all-white walls. Sorry. Everything in that house was white. I was even known to wear an all-white suit. White hat, white suit, white shoes. Not today, however. You people look so warm. I drove a custom-built all-white Lincoln Continental, and I owned 2 all-white Thunderbirds. On a more somber note, in 1986, I began a year-long battle with lung cancer, which took my life in June of 1987, passing away in California at the age of 73. Now, I know we don't have a whole lot of time allotted to us to speak today, but trust me, I could go on for days telling you more stories about the things I was involved with. For example, this beautiful car here behind me. I could tell you stories about car manufacturing that I made this car. I could tell you things about it that would last for days, but we don't have the time, and I apologize. So maybe when you're done with your trip today through the cemetery, you can stop by and ask the gentleman that owns this car all of the questions that you would like to ask him. But on your next trip back to the cemetery, perhaps we can all sit down and talk about the Muntz Motorcycle Park, or the Muntz stereo pack that I developed that Bill Lear of Lear Jet fame heard and started putting in all of his jets. Or we can simply talk about the Book of the Muntz Club. Until then, I want your help. Remember, I told you that I wanted to tell you a story about my famous billboard. Obviously, the lung cancer is still with me. So I want your help. We're going to return to the days of radio. I want you to close your eyes. Please, all of you, trust me, I'm not going to take your wallets, all right? Close your eyes as I try to paint a picture in your mind. You are sitting behind the wheel of your automobile. You're driving on the expressway. You're in heavy traffic. Don't speed. You're in heavy traffic. As far as your eyes can see in front of you are nothing but red brake lights. As far as your eyes can see in the rear view mirror, there's nothing but headlights. You are going nowhere. You look up through your windshield up to the right, and you see a large billboard which has my face on it and my finger pointing right to you, the driver of that automobile. The caption reads, "You look stupid behind that wheel." I got your attention, didn't I? And wasn't that what it was all about? Getting your attention and getting you to remember my name, M-U-N-T-Z. That's Muntz. Folks, thanks for stopping by. Have a great day. Enjoy your tour through the cemetery.
Guten Tag. Wie geht's? My name is John Joseph Thiel. I was born in Sachsenstadt, Germany, December 22nd, 1822. While in Germany as a young man, I learned the shoemaker's trade. In the 1840s, it was a very difficult time in the fatherland. There was very much civil unrest. And so in 1848, I decided to come to America. I worked for a few years in New Jersey, where I worked in a small shoe store and saved my money. And I heard of many of the German folks coming to the West for their increased opportunity. So I come to Elgin in 1853. I had enough money to open a small shoe store on North Grove Avenue. And one day while working in my shoe store, a beautiful young Swiss girl by the name of Rosalie Zumstead came into the store. And as you can imagine, I fell in love very quickly. And by 1858, we were married. I'd always wanted to try my hand at farming after working many years as a cobbler. So in 1860, we purchased a small farm west of Elgin in the little village of Udina. While at the farm, I had two beautiful daughters, however, no sons. My first son, John Jr., was born in 1865, and my youngest son, Frank Charles, was born in 1867. But how about by this time I was almost 45 years old trying to work a farm. It was very difficult at that time to work a farm by yourself. So regrettably I had to sell the farm, and we moved back to Elgin, and this time I purchased a new shoe store on Milwaukee Street. We were very happy in Elgin, very comfortable life, until one fateful fall day in 1885. You see, my young son Frank at that time was working at the watch factory. And young Frank was a very energetic and personable young man. He wanted to try something new. So he took a job as a traveling book salesman, selling Bibles. And he took off on his first trip and ended up in the village of Dixon. And he rented a hotel room in Dixon. And it just so happened at that time there was a pump factory in Dixon, and after work the boys and the men would go out behind the pump factory and they would play baseball. And young Frank thought this would be a perfect location, a perfect opportunity to meet many people to sell his Bibles. After the game, a small, dark-complected Frenchman by the name of Joseph Moss came up to my son Frank and said that he knew many farm families south of town, that he would be more than happy to introduce my young son Frank to the farm families to sell Bibles. Well, of course, Frank, 18 years old, he thought this was a very neighborly thing to do, so off the road they went. My young son Frank was never seen alive again. You can imagine, we were quite concerned. We heard nothing from Frank for over a week and a half. He was very good about telegraphing us or writing us. The next day, according to horrors that happened at that time, we received a telegraph, not from young Frank, but from the sheriff of Dixon, that a young man matching the description of my young son Frank was found buried beneath a bridge in Dixon with his throat slit from ear to ear. You can imagine the distress of my wife. I could not leave her side. My young son, oldest son, John Jr., decided to make the sad trip to Dixon to identify the remains. When he got there, in fact, the remains were of my young son, Frank. 4 days later, John Jr. returned with Frank's body to Elgin, I had 5 children, and 4 of the 5 were working in the watch factory. You can imagine how quickly the news of this murder of an 18-year-old boy who was a former watch factory employee spread across the town. At the funeral and the burial at Channing Street, there were over 2,000 mourners who attended. You may ask, why would this young Frenchman murder an 18-year-old boy? As it turned out, Mr. Moss had engaged to a young woman to be married, and when he went to purchase the marriage license, he had no money. My young son, Frank, was murdered for $14. The sheriff became very suspicious of Mr. Moss and went out to investigate and interview Mr. Moss. And Mr. Moss came down from a haystack and he said to the sheriff, "One moment, I've got to get a drink of water." He went to the pump, took something out of his pocket and threw it in the brush. When the sheriff investigated, he found a watch chain. When he showed it to my older son, John identified it as the watch chain we had given Frank as a Christmas present. Mr. Moss apparently had also rented a buckboard. The sheriff of Dixon, being a good policeman, went to look at the buckboard, turned over the lap robe in the buckboard and found bloodstains. And the next day, a young woman came forward and she said she had seen Mr. Moss walking along the road near the murder site with a muddy spade hidden under his coat. So, as you can imagine, Mr. Moss was found guilty and sentenced to put in prison for the rest of his life. Our life was never quite the same after that. We did manage to build a new house in 1893 overlooking Lord's Park. However, on Christmas Eve, 1902, I walked across the street to my daughter's home and died on the steps. 4 years later, my wife Rosalia passed away. And to this day, if you travel south of Dixon, there's a small country road with a sign, and it's called Bloody Gulch Road, to mark the location of the murder of my son Frank. Thank you for listening to my life story.
Hello.
Hello.
Seems to be getting a little bit chillier. Helps if you're walking around. You guys have been doing some hills today, I see. My name is Hattie Griffin. I was a teacher and a civic leader in Elgin for over 50 years. I was born in Haverford, Massachusetts in 1862. My parents were Walter and Elizabeth George Griffin, and I was one of 4 children. My brothers were George and Frank, and I had a sister, Elizabeth, who died before she reached the age of 10. I received my education at Rockford High School and Chicago Normal School. I took postgraduate classes at Chicago and Illinois universities, Harvard University in Massachusetts, and Columbia University in New York. My family moved to Elgin in 1881, and my father opened a bakery. I began my teaching career at the age of 21 in 1883. I taught in Chicago. In 1886 to 1889, I was the teacher for the 5th and 6th grade at the old brick school. I went back to teach in Chicago until I took over the 7th and 8th grade classes at the old Elgin High School at the corner of Chapel and DuPage Street. In 1897, I became the principal of Lincoln School. Lincoln School was originally named National School, and it was located at the corner of National and Villa Street. It was opened in 1883 as a 2-room schoolhouse for the cost of $7,000. The following year, 2 additional classrooms were opened for $2,000 more. In 1890 and 1891, a basement was added and 5 additional schoolrooms. The Lincoln School served the Elgin community and its students for 85 years. I'm told it closed in 1968 with the consolidation of the Franklin and Lincoln students to become the Channing Memorial Elementary School. While I was principal at Lincoln School, I instituted a program for students to change classes, and they did that every hour. I also began music and art classes. I encouraged parents to come to the school frequently to talk about their students' successes and to work on any problems. I was very interested in the physical education of students and began supervised play during school hours at Lincoln School. One of the early Boy Scout troops was started at Lincoln School with members, student members. And I also began a program which is now known as the Patrol Boys program, having the older students help the younger students cross the street because the automobiles came into use. My interest in physical education went beyond the walls of the classroom. My friend Myrtle Huff and I, Myrtle was the principal of Columbia School in Elgin, we were very concerned about the lack of recreational facilities for the young women who were coming to work in Elgin. I spoke with a group, the Young Women's Christian Association in Chicago, and they were interested in beginning a chapter in Elgin. Many women in Elgin were very interested in this effort as well. Mrs. A.B. Church donated the property at 220 Chicago Street, and Mrs. George Peck and Mrs. J.G. Tapper were the women who spearheaded the campaign fundraising event to rebuild the facility at the same location. The first physical and social activities for the YWCA took place at the gymnasium of the National Watch Factory. The Watch Factory supported this endeavor and loaned us the use of their gym. Any woman of good moral character could join the YWCA for $1. Mr. and Mrs. George Lord were also asked for donations to build the facility, and at first they were reluctant, but they did donate $10,000. The facility was expanded to include a swimming pool and a cafeteria, and the cafeteria at the YWCA provided jobs for women in the area, and it also was a source of income for the organization. And we instituted a program to begin serving carry-out meals on Sundays, and the program was so popular that people were lined up down the hill to come in and purchase their meal to carry out on Sunday. I'm told that many organizations were spawned from the YWCA, including the Newcomers Club, the Junior Service Board, the Community Crisis Center, and the Well Child Center. I belonged to many organizations while I was in Elgin. I was a member of the First Baptist Church, the American Association of University Women, the Perry Literary Circle, and I served on the board of directors for the Elgin Women's Club for many years. The last 10 years of my life, from 1933 until 1943, I was on the board of directors for the Elgin Old People's Home, which was later renamed the Oak Crest Residence. I lived a long and satisfying life of 81 years. On September 21st, 1943, I died at 6 o'clock at Sherman Hospital. I left my home at 127 North Gifford and property that I owned in Warren, Michigan at the golf course and country club subdivision, and stocks of shares in companies like Leith & Company, AT&T, Commonwealth Edison, and Armour Swift Company, to my brother George's 3 children, Gertrude, Genevieve, and Ralph. I also left property to Myrtle Huff, my longtime friend. In closing today, I would like to remind you that we are all teachers. We learn every day from ourselves and from our friends and family. And remember too that every day we're making history. Thank you for your kind attention. Class is dismissed.
Most people here in Elgin, and so I probably was at your birth. I also am a skilled nurse. Now, if you were born before 1852, that wouldn't be true, because Mr. Pask and I didn't come across the pond from England until that time to settle here in Elgin. And we settled over on Division Street. Possibly you brought his marvelous green and colored vegetables, because he operated a truck farm. We had 7 children while we lived there, and I was very concerned about them. Being a nurse, I was going out helping the unfortunate and those that with contagious disease. I was greatly bothered about possibly bringing home something. So I was really glad when in 1888, Mr. Henry Sherman cooperated with the Elgin Women's Club to build, well, really not build, because he had that 2-story house there at Channing and North. And now you're here at the new hospital to see one of my sons. You probably know George. He probably delivers your mail. But you want to see Francis. Oh, here we are at room 106. Let's see if Francis is up for visitors. Francis? Francis?
Hi, Ma.
Hi.
Visitors, hi. Hey, that was a nice article on you in the paper Saturday.
It certainly was. You know, I guess when you get as old as I am, you can have your birthday picture on the front page. And I think that's because I know so many people helping to have them enter the world.
So how was church today?
Long.
Well, I'm glad you're going to the Free Methodist. I'm just as happy they turned me down for membership because I had belonged to the Elks Club. I'm better off at First Methodist Episcopal. They don't care what kind of strange organizations you belong to.
Now, you shouldn't say that, Francis.
Well, I don't know how many people have asked me here at the hospital, how did I get the name Shaunti?
I'm surprised you don't remember. You were about 8 years old, and your school chums, you know the school you attended where the Abbey C. Wing School is located now, there was Jeff and Billy Hunter and Fly. They come up Division Street and want to see if you could come out. And your little sister Julia was just really learning how to talk, and she had the hardest time saying Francis. But she wanted to be there when there was a knock at the door. And so every time she opened her mouth to say your name, it came out Shaunti. But you've never spelled it that way. You spelled it Shanty.
Probably part of our English heritage.
Could be.
You know, I had that same dream again last night.
What dream is that?
Oh, you know, I'm up at Powers Lake, just over the Wisconsin border.
Not too far from where you built your own cabin.
Yeah. And I'm working as a carpenter again up on the top of the barn there, 20 feet high.
Well, you know, if you look out the window here in your room, that tree over there, that branch that hangs over the road, that's about 20 feet high off the ground. That's a fir piece.
Yeah. Well, then to fall down and land on my leg was bad.
Yes, that was hard.
And then bringing me back to Elgin and staying at home and just using mustard plasters.
Well, they thought that would help you, but as you and I both know, that did not do the case.
Yeah, it seemed like such an old-fashioned treatment. I was better off coming up to the hospital here in 1950.
Yes, you were. Time passes.
My mother passed away in 1919 at the age of 88, and she's buried down at Bluff City Cemetery in the family plot just back of Hattie Griffin's area. It wasn't until Mother passed away that I realized what a sharp businesswoman she was. Because when I first came to the hospital, they were charging $5 a week to care for me. And she got it reduced now to $10 a month, since she was doing a lot of the nursing. But she was here every single day. But after she died, then I realized she had transferred title to a house we had to the hospital. And in return for the house, the hospital agreed to take care of me for the rest of my life. So I have no financial concerns anymore at all. And you're probably wondering what this thing is at the foot of the bed here. even though my legs are paralyzed, the weight of the sheet or a blanket is very painful. So it's just a plain old box down here, but it does elevate the weight of these things, makes it much more comfortable for me. Now, I enjoy reading the Bible 3 times a day, and as you can see, it's getting a little worse for wear. Sherman Hospital has a school for nursing, and the average class is probably about 10 young women each year. So I started writing their names down in the Bible beginning in 1913. So I've kept good record of them. And for my 79th birthday, a group of them got together and baked a cake. And we had a nice little party in my home here, room 106. One of the nurses, Margaret Pate, who calls me an old grouch, her mother has this bakery over on Algona. It's about 6-7 blocks away. And Margaret arranged to get permission for me to go in a wheelchair over to her mother's bakery one day. So I got to sample the baked goods there, and that was my furthest trip from the hospital since I've been here. Margaret has been seeing this young farmer named Bud Kenyon. I don't know how serious they're going to be, but besides reading the papers or the Bible, I enjoy reading the newspapers. I like reading Ripley's Believe It or Not column. They have such a strange grouping of things and people that appear in there. And I also get to follow the results of my Cubbies. Are there any of you Cubs fans here? Oh, great. Well, I really got a kick when the Cubs won the National League pennant in 1918. That was the year they beat out the New York Giants, and the critics said the only reason the Cubs won was because all the good Giants players had been drafted into the Army. But the Cubs played the Red Sox then for the World Series, and they lost because the Red Sox had this hot pitcher named Ruth, and he won 2 games out of the series. And after the series was over, the Red Sox traded Ruth to the Yankees, and the Yankees had sense enough to play him in the outfield where he could bat every day. And you know, the rest is history. Well, Mr. Wrigley was the first one to let his games be broadcast on the radio. And it's about time for the Cubs games to come on. So I think I'm going to be listening here. When you come again, give me a call on my telephone. My number is 234. Thanks very much for coming.
Over the years, Shanti's picture appeared many times in the newspaper. And after his death on April 14, 1941, he appeared in Ripley's Believe It or Not for being the patient for the longest time in any American hospital. Believe it or not.
All of you who are residents of Elgin, and any of you who have traveled through Elgin, perhaps on your way north to Dundee or south to St. Charles, have almost uncertainly had your traveling vistas altered by my life of industry. So you might be asking yourself, who is this fellow? Is he an architect, a sculptor, a horticulturalist, perhaps a traffic cop? No, my name is Cyrus Henry Woodruff, and my foundry forever changed the face of Elgin and the lives of school children, opera goers, bicyclists, coffee drinkers, and soldiers around the world. I was born on February 15th, 1819, in West Stockbridge, Massachusetts. My family was one of the oldest in America. My father Henry fought in the War of 1812, and my grandfather Asaph fought in the Revolutionary War under George Washington. While I was out east, I worked on a farm, I taught school, I owned a hardware store, I even served my county as postmaster and representative to the state legislature. But indeed, my greatest achievement was winning the heart of Miss Louisa Sprague, who, from Austerlitz, New York, whom I married on March 19th, 1840. Also, before I left Massachusetts to come to the Great Midwest, I worked briefly in an iron foundry, which planted the seeds that would grow into a spirit of entrepreneurship in the years to come. In 1856, we migrated to Illinois and settled briefly in Pecatonica and Lena before settling in Dundee in 1862, where I, with 5 other founders, founded the Illinois Iron and Bolt Company, where I served as secretary and treasurer. But quickly realized that I'd like to found my own foundry, no pun intended, which I did and realized my dream in 1867 in Clintonville, Illinois, which you all know today as South Elgin. The foundry grew so quickly, however, that just 11 years later, we moved to a huge 34,000 square foot facility on North State Street in Elgin. By 1887, we were melting 150 tons of pig iron a day to ship our most prevalent products at the time, which were iron castings for school desks and opera chairs. We shipped them all over the United States into such exotic countries as Australia and Chile. With our prosperity, as it increased, also our diversity of our production line increased. We produced other things. During the bicycle craze of the 1890s, we were very successful with our 2 models of bicycles appropriately named the Elgin King and the Elgin Queen, each selling for $100 each. Also during this era, we specialized in cast iron architectural accents that you can see in some of the finest buildings in the Elgin and Chicagoland area. And of course, the Elgin National Coffee Mill. Now, the superior craftsmanship that the Elgin National Coffee Mill was known for is best exhibited in the industrial model, which was actually about as tall as my shoulder, and you can see a fine example of it in the Elgin Historical Society Museum. They were used primarily in hotels and restaurants and grocery stores to ground huge amounts of beans down into grounds to make coffee for their patrons. But as the quality of the industrial model grew, people also bought the smaller bottle could be used by consumers in their homes. Here's a fine example of one of those. You can see you put your beans in the top here, you grind it with this wheel. On the industrial model, this large wheel would have an adaptation for a steam engine to run it, and then your grounds come out the bottom. These actually became so ubiquitous in the Elgin area that young Elgin boys would often raid these for components to make their coaster cars for the Elgin road races. Burdened by a rheumatic condition, I was forced to retire from the company in the 1890s and turn operations over to my son, Charles Henry Woodruff, who eventually became president of the company. In 1900, Mr. A.D. Edwards bought a 50% interest in the foundry, and it was known thereafter as Woodruff and Edwards. They adapted their product line with the technology of the times and became known for power corn shellers, for small steam engines, and for iron castings for oven ranges and furnaces and washing machines. Unfortunately, I did not live to see the success of my company at its apex. I passed quietly on October 11th, 1910, just 4 years after my beloved Louisa. But my legacy of determination lived on far after my passing. Even though a fire engulfed the factory in 1918 and burned it almost to the ground, even as the flames were still licking at the frame of the former structure, my successor was contracting the construction of the next. Indeed, the very next day, in sub-zero weather, reconstruction began, and within a month, the factory was operable yet again. It grew quickly. It eventually covered 5 whole city blocks in Elgin, stretching all the way from Lawrence Avenue to Mountain Street. During World War II, they devoted their entire output to the war effort. In fact, Woodruff and Edwards was only the 2nd gray iron foundry ever to be awarded the Army-Navy E flag with 2 stars for war production. You see, the Navy needed propellers for their landing craft for the invasion of North Africa. And while other foundries were telling the Navy they could produce 12 propellers a day, Woodruff and Edwards had their employees work around the clock and produced 100 propellers a day. Sadly, Woodruff and Edwards was forced to close in 1987. It was an inevitable victim of the unstoppable trend of globalization. In 1989, the buildings were razed. But in 1992, Foundry Park was dedicated on a small portion of the former site. So I encourage you all, the next time you're traveling north to Dundee or south to St. Charles, to stop and sit on a bench and read the plaque and reflect upon how one man's life work can touch the lives of so many. From the first time they sit in a school chair or attend an opera, to the last time they ride their bicycle to Al's Cafe for a cup of coffee. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Frank Brown. But I appear before you as I was on a cold November night 125 years ago in 1878, when Elgin's population was about 7,000 and our only burial ground was down on Channing Street. I was a medical student at Rush Medical College in Chicago. My father was a prominent Elgin physician and surgeon, and my mother, of course, was very active as a social leader in Elgin. Why I did what I did on that terrible night, I will never understand, but it is something I have regretted all of my life. Because on that night, I became a resurrectionist, a person who raises the dead. I got the idea from an article in an Elgin Weekly Advocate newspaper. The newspaper contained an article from the Louisville Courier-Journal of an interview with a resurrectionist or grave robber. And this article described how a professional went about it. In the first sentence, he said, there are 3 tools necessary to the professional body snatcher: a spade, a keyhole saw, and a rope with a slip knot. Then he went on and described how you go about this. Generally, grave robbers or resurrectionists went to the Potter's Field sections of cemeteries. This is because the poor people buried there were not prominent enough for relatives to make a big to-do if the grave robbers were caught. Why I got the idea from this newspaper, I don't know, because I robbed a grave not to take it to Rush Medical College, where I was a student, but to take it to the Chicago Homeopathic College on Michigan Avenue for $25. And since I had to hire Sam Johnson, a black man, to help me, and I had to go 6 hours by wagon carrying this stinking body into Chicago to the college, all I was going to get out of it at the most was $15. I selected Gardner Havelstein, a derelict, to be the choice of my robbery. He was a derelict buried in Potter's Field. He had been buried on the Wednesday he committed suicide, and I did my digging on Friday. We had to have no light of any kind because the sexton's cottage was right across the way from the cemetery, and late at night any kind of light would be seen for a long period of time, perhaps a mile. So we were working there in the darkness. And according to this professional's article, you needed the keyhole saw because you only dug up half the grave. You were aiming for the head of the grave. And you punched a hole in the coffin and you sawed away. Then you slipped the knot, the rope around the head of the deceased and slipped it out of the coffin and lifted it up onto the wagon. Sam and I just retched at the terrible odor that came out of that coffin. Oh, I couldn't look at it. Sam put a sack over one head, over the head, and a sack over the feet, and we covered it with sackcloth, loaded it on the wagon, and started our trip into Chicago. 6 hours of a jolting wagon with that stink in back of us. When we got there, the medical school wouldn't take the body. He said, we can't take a body like this. It isn't fresh. It's too putrefied. She's been dead at least 6 or 7 weeks. She has been dead? We got the wrong grave. We dug up the body of a poor German immigrant woman whose husband had no money and she was buried in Potter's Field. The next morning, the sexton noticed at once that there was an open grave. We even forgot to put the dirt back in. He contacted John Powers, who was the city marshal. The chief of police was then called the marshal. Marshal Powers telegraphed Chicago asking if they had any evidence of resurrectionists in the city. They said, "We sure have. We caught 2. Sam and myself." Marshal Powers said, "I'll be in to get them." He brought handcuffs, loaded us on a Chicago Northwestern East Side train. That's the one that used to come in on Douglas Avenue. And he realized that there would probably be a mob to welcome us because the whole town knew about it within hours after this happened and the discovery of the open grave. At that time, the lockup in the City Hall was on South Grove Avenue. So Marshal Powers stopped the train 3 blocks south of the station and hustled us over to the lockup. Then the mob came down from the station and grouped itself around the City Hall, talking about lynch and roping. I suppose if it had been a prominent person, they'd have dragged us out of the jail. Within hours, my father, a wealthy man, bailed me out and Sam out, cost him $800 apiece for each of us. And then he settled with the husband of the woman whose grave we robbed. I don't know how much that cost, but probably the whole episode cost him at least $3,000. I didn't come out right away after I was bailed because the mob, at least the remnants of it, kept standing outside yelling. So I waited until dark. My father got a carriage and horse, and I dashed out of the jail and got on that carriage and drove away and wasn't seen in Elgin for a long time. I went out to Colorado, became a doctor there, and in 1890 I came to Elgin to visit my family, and I had a heart attack here, which is why I'm buried in Bluff City Cemetery. Over there, the grave isn't by the walk, so I'm not speaking by the gravestone. I regretted as long as I lived what I had done that night, and I hope you will have no occasion to regret something that you have done. Now today, of course, we donate organs for those who need them, and we don't have resurrections because we have an organization called the Anatomical Society. You can get the name and address and telephone number from the funeral home, who will come and get the body within hours. And then the body is taken to the University of Chicago Medical School and Northwestern University Medical School. But when the resurrections were active in the latter part of the 19th century, people worried about grave robbing, and some would have concrete and heavy stones poured in on top of the coffin before the dirt was piled on. And they also worried, of course, about being buried alive. Well, it's been a rather grisly tale. I didn't tell you the worst of it, because sometimes when the resurrectionists would haul a body up by the head came off. And I guess that's enough.
I really don't imagine that anybody here is familiar with my name, Lysander Hamlin. I'm just a businessman, but I'm absolutely certain that every one of you uses Hamlin's Wizard Oil in your home. No? Well, then perhaps you all must have the Hamlin's Wizard Oil cookbook that you use in your kitchens. Yeah. No. I don't know about this. Is very unusual. Well, perhaps then maybe those of you who don't cook very well. The songbook then, the Hamlin's Wizard Oil songbook, perhaps you have that and you entertain? Well, you know, there's something going on here. I know. Okay, forgive me. They did tell me, and I completely forgot. This is a different time, isn't it? Well, I suppose that I'm going to have to tell you about it. You see, my family, the Hamlins, have been in this country since before the War of the Revolution. My father was a physician in Ohio, where I was born in 1939, or 1839, forgive me. My brother, John, and I began a business. It was the sale and manufacturing of Hamlin's Wizard Oil. We began it in Cincinnati, Ohio, and it was our first location before the Civil War. I suppose that our approach to the business was a result of a couple of things. First, it was my interest in medicinal cures, probably inspired by my father's profession. John's interest was in magic. John was an amateur magician, and a very good one at that. So in our business venture, we combined the two. We moved our business to Chicago after the Civil War, and for 2 years, 1867 and 1868, we actually relocated the business here to Elgin. But then we moved it back to Chicago. I, however, because I had married an Elgin girl, Ella Town, became a resident here. In 1868, I purchased a wonderful 11-room mansion at 120 South State Street. Oh, it was a wonderful house. We had 5 bedrooms. We had a parlor. We had a sewing room and servants' quarters. As part of our business, we used wagons and horses. And in the winter months, when we weren't using the wagons in the north, just in the south, we had spares. And so we would park the spare wagons behind our house at 120 South State Street. And the horses, the spare horses, were stabled in the stable out back. Well, I wanted also to tell you that the reason that the house was such a necessity for the house to be big as it was and have so many rooms is that Ella and I had 4 children. We had 3 boys and a girl that we all raised right here in Elgin in that house. Well, now I've told you a little bit about what we did, but I didn't really give you the details because they're a little, well, they're difficult for a person to, oh, darn. Could you excuse me for just a minute? There might be a better way to do this.
Get your Wizard Oil brochures. Get your Wizard Oil brochures. Get your Wizard Oil brochures. It clears up the sinuses pretty good. Pass it down. Here.
Oh, thank you.
Pass them down.
And I'm so glad to be here in this little town of ours this evening. I hope you folks have been well entertained by the quartet and everybody else here. And now I want to talk to you about a little something here. I happen to have these 3 equal-sized pieces of rope that I want to talk about. Now these, I thought they were equal-sized. Well, what do I have here? Okay, I think maybe I can make these all the same size. All right, let's just do that, and then let's do that, and perhaps we should do that. All right, now we have 4 equal-sized pieces of rope, right? Oh, all right. Let's see here. I thought there were 4 equal size. Yes, they are. They are 3 equal. Did I say 4? No, 3 equal size pieces of rope. I said 3. I said 4. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thanks very much, folks. Now that I've done the little magic, I wanted to talk to you about why I actually am here this evening, and that is to tell you about this wonderful product
Hamlin's Wizard Oil. Ah, yes, Hamlin's Wizard Oil. There is no disease that it can't cure. No, there's no sore that it can't heal and no ache that won't go away with the liberal use of Hamlin's Wizard Oil. Now, you can apply it externally or you can apply it internally. It is a certain cure for rheumatism, sprains, bruises, lame back, frostbites, diarrhea, burns and scalds, toothache, deafness, burns, bites of dog, diphtheria, gastralgia, cholera morbus, and bleeding gums. And the best thing about this, folks, is that it can be used on cattle and horses as well. We have this 75-cent size, and we have a 35-cent smaller size for those of you who don't really need that much. Boy, take these citizens' orders for the thing that they came for.
Did anybody not get the little brochure? Let's see. Ah! Oh. Get the half size for 35 cents and the, okay, he's back.
I trust that the wizard and the boy kind of explained to you how we marketed Wizard Oil. You see, our people actually sang for their sales. Each troop that went out to visit the small towns consisted of 6 people, a driver, a lecturer, and a 4-man quartet. Is there any other kind? The wagon was specially equipped with a parlor organ and was drawn by a horse team of 4 or 6. The wagon would pull into the small town, find a place to set up, and then in the evening, by the light of torches, the wagon would serve as a stage. The 4-man quartet, dressed nattily in silk top hats and pinstripe trousers and very well tailored jackets and shoes with spats, would stand up and serenade the town. The magicians would do their magic, and the people would be exposed to the benefits of Hamlin's Wizard Oil and all that it could do for their health, and they would buy it. The lecturer had a different job. It was the lecturer's job to go out into the town and talk to the pharmacists, the proprietors of the drugstores. And he made sure that they had an ample supply of Hamlin's Wizard Oil for their shelves, so that long after the wagon was gone and we had left town, that the people could still have the benefits of Hamlin's Wizard Oil in their lives on a day-to-day basis. Well, we promoted the use of our songbooks and our cookbooks. We published these. We sold them, or we gave them away, actually. We didn't sell these. We gave them to the people in the towns by the thousands. Using the songbooks, when we came back the next year, they would know the words to the songs, and they would sing along with us. It was a wonderful thing. The people were very, very well entertained. We used this method of reaching to the people, and then we would have our troop busy day and night. In the evenings, they would go out to church groups and social organizations, and they would entertain there. They would stay in one town for a week or more. Later, as radio came along, we promoted and sponsored radio shows. We had a radio show weekly on WWVA in Wheeling, West Virginia. That was a country radio show. And we also had a show weekly on WLS in Chicago. Well, the Wizard Oil Company was a very good reward to me, as I told you earlier, enabling me to live in a wonderful place here in Elgin, in a wonderful house, and become a board member of the Union Bank and a well-respected citizen. My brother John didn't live here in Elgin. He actually stayed in Chicago. And with the funds that he acquired from the Wizard Oil business, John actually invested in an opera house in Chicago just after the Great Fire. He put his money into an opera house that was wonderful. It was the finest opera house in the city, and it bore the family name and was later changed and called the Chicago Opera House. You see that young fellow over there? That's my nephew, young Fred Hamlin. Young Fred here was John's son. And when young Fred was about this age, he'd take his summers and get on the wagons and go out among the small towns and watch what the people on the wagons did. I don't know that Fred wanted to follow in those footsteps and be directly associated with Wizard Oil, but he did, in a way, follow the family business. I think perhaps a little because of the inspiration of show business that he saw on the wagons, Fred grew up to become a musical producer and the manager of the Chicago Opera House. And along came a couple of fellows one time, and they said, "Mr. Hamlin, we would like you to produce a musical. It's a musical taken from a book that we have the rights to. We've wrote the words and music, and we think it'll be a very good success." Well, Fred, the adult grown-up producer, was probably the most respected in Chicago at that time. He didn't like the words. He didn't like the music. But Fred Hamlin produced the musical version of The Wizard of Oz anyway. Well, thank you all for coming here to hear about Hamlin's Wizard Oil. I hope that you will become familiar with its great benefits to your health, because it certainly is good for mine. Thank you. Thank you, Fred.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on this chilly day. My name is Lucy Lovell. Lucy Smith Lovell, my maiden name, originally from Oneida County in New York. My father came over from England and settled there in Oneida County, married my mother, and I was born in 1806. Fortunately for me, my parents were very much advocates of education. And so, as a young girl, I was given the best education that money could buy in Oneida County at that time. As a young woman, I became a school teacher and enjoyed my profession very much. I fell in love with also a school teacher. His name was Vincent Seller Lovell. Vincent was a jack of many trades. Besides education, he was a merchant and a farmer. And in 1840, we traveled to Chicago, where we began our new life together. My husband had a very prominent business at the intersection of Clark Street and Lake Street in Chicago. It was about at that time that I delivered our first son. His name was Edward. Shortly thereafter, we were traveling west and we discovered Elgin. Elgin was a beautiful young town at that time, and we were very enamored with the Fox River, with the groves and trees, but most of all, the beautiful, wonderful people that we met when we were here. And so we decided to begin our roots in Elgin. We bought a parcel of land from the Giffords, about 150 acres. My husband became good friends with Mr. Gifford, and the two of them shared the same belief that public school systems needed to be put in place in this new and growing town. And so they began plans for an Elgin Academy. Unfortunately, my husband's life was taken very early. He was only 42 years when he passed away. I had already delivered our second son, Vincent. He was then only 7 years old and without a father. The boys ages 7 and 10. I was still teaching in Elgin, and in 1856, my husband's dream did come true, although he was not here to see it, the first day that we opened our doors at the Elgin Academy. I was for some time a teacher there. My boys both one of the first students that attended that school. Now, 4 years later, the boys were ready to move on to college, and they both had their sights set on the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I made the decision to travel along with them and found someone to oversee my home here in Elgin during that period. I found a small cottage which I rented in Ann Arbor, and I took care of all the housekeeping and cooked the meals for the boys while they were in school. Now, their schooling continued for 8 years, and in 1870, they both graduated at the same time. Edward, the oldest, with a law degree, and Vincent, younger by 3 years, with his bachelor's. And when we moved back to Elgin, Edward began a fascinating career here in Elgin. He began by teaching at the New Brick School, which is right off of Kimball, and I believe Center Street. He was rapidly promoted and soon became the principal of that school. However, he had to resign that position as he had enlisted into the service and did quite well in the service, becoming the captain of the C Company, 153rd Infantry. You'll see his mark is over here. Upon his return to Elgin, Edward then pursued his law and was a lawyer for some time in Elgin. Later became a judge. He also was part of the Board of Education. He also became interested, along with many other townspeople at that time, to build a library in Elgin, and was asked to be on the Board of Directors for a 2-year term. He did that and then was asked again to commit to another 3-year term. Now, because of his advanced education and his interest in literary works, he was asked to take a sum of money and go abroad to Europe to try and locate and acquire several books throughout Europe. He went and talked directly with the publishers and acquired a good many books. He returned back to Elgin with over 1,500 books for the initial library here in town. My younger son, Vincent, after college, had a love for journalism and was offered a position in Albany, New York. He did take that position. He moved out to Albany. He became very active with journalism and with printing. He did move up within his position as well and became editor for some time. Unfortunately, though, Vincent had failing health issues and had to resign that position as it was a very demanding position. He returned back home where I nurtured him to health for a little over a year. It was that time that his older brother encouraged him to travel abroad before he became tied down again with another career. And so he followed his brother's idea of traveling throughout Europe. I must say at this time that his older brother also encouraged him to look up a young lady by the name of Eliza Hamden, in which he did, and he fell head over heels in love with her. In Austria, they were married, and he brought Eliza back home to live in Elgin. Eliza became the daughter I never had. We were very close. I called her Lizzie. Lizzie and Vincent lived with me for some time until they were able to build their own home. And their home was built on Liberty Street. And in honor of her first mother, who was still in Austria, Eliza's mother's name was Margaret. The dirt road that was built in front of her home was then named Margaret Place. So that beautiful home is still standing there, Margaret Place and Liberty Street. About a year after Eliza joined our family, my older son Edward became the mayor of Elgin, and he did quite well. He was the first Elgin mayor that was not wedded. A very eligible bachelor at 35 years. He only served one term, but then he went to his 10-year reunion at the University of Michigan, and he himself fell head over heels in love with a medical student there who was getting her license to practice, and her name was Carrie Watrous. Carrie returned to Elgin. They were married and began a family. My first grandchild was named after me. Her name is Lucy, and this is her site right here. Lucy. I was blessed with another granddaughter. Her name was Margaret. And my third grandchild, Vincent, named after my husband, only lived with us 1 year. Over the years, Vincent's health was declining, but he was able to also become the mayor of Elgin. That was in 1877. He served one term. And it was during that period that I decided to live my husband's legacy on by donating $5,000, and that was the amount of money needed to construct a 3-story building next to the Elgin Academy. And this building was to be used as a trade center, a learning manual training center, so that while the students were preparing on for college and advanced education, they would be able to also learn a trade. The first floor consisted of a foundry and a blacksmith shop. The second story was for machine, and the third story was a woodworking shop. Now, a friend of mine, Mrs. Lord, you may know of Lord's Park, Mrs. Lord donated all the equipment and supplies necessary once the building was complete. It took about 2 years. And Mrs. Lord supplied all the supplies to accommodate 32 students. My son Vincent did pass away. He was only 47 years old. I was at his bedside. He never had any children. Lizzie and I were with him when he passed away. He did, although over the years, adopt 2 children. 2 years after his death, at a ripe old age of 88, I passed away. My time here in Elgin was spent almost 50 years in Elgin. I lived here, 25 of those years spent with educating students. I enjoyed every day of mine here in Elgin. I think what I would like for you to take away today is that when I arrived here in Elgin in the early 1840s, it was a very small community, only a couple thousand at best, people who were determined to take this beautiful land and build a strong foundation. And over the course of my almost 50 years here, I did see that happen. At the time of my passing, this beautiful city accommodated 25,000 people. So thank you for joining me today. I'm going to point out our landmarks here. This is my stone and my husband's. And this is my oldest son, Edward, his wife, Carrie, their 3 children. And this is my younger son, Vincent. And on the opposite side of this stone, you'll see his wife, Eliza. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today.